As good as George Russell's pole lap for Mercedes was in Singapore today, and it was good, it was sensational to watch George on the absolute limit. The ultimate long corner driver of the 2025 season, you could say, shaving down to the tiniest of margins. Lots of straight line, wide entries, but everything done to perfection. Reminiscent in some ways of Ayrton Senna, the way he put pole laps together as well. So congratulations to George for that. But there will always be the unanswered question: could Max have got the pole in Singapore? Very difficult to answer that, of course, because we'll never know. We'll never know exactly what he would have done in Sector 3. But before we go much further, let's have a look exactly at how the sectors panned out. That's what George did in sectors 1, 2 and 3. He's slightly slower in Sector 2 on the lap that got him that beautiful 29.1, which was breathtaking. It happened on the first phase of Q3. George Russell, who had had the shunt yesterday, wasn't that well in Baku, drove really well, suddenly doing this lap like a bolt of lightning over Singapore. Brilliant to watch. 29.1. Could Max Verstappen, who had done a really good job with the Red Bull throughout Friday and FP3 and at the beginning of qualifying, and had shown how good the car and he was going to be with tyre management and the longer runs they could do, could Max then beat that 29.1 of George Russell? And he went out on his first run, did a 29.3, came in, put on another new set of soft Pirellis, went out. And you can see there what he did in Sector 1, 26.512, slightly slower than George. But then look at Sector 2, 37.458, actually slightly slower than Max's best, a bit like George, but nonetheless quicker than George. So it was all to play for going into Sector 3. Bear in mind, on his previous lap, Max had done a 25.220 on Sector 3. Now, if he had repeated that, he would have done a 29.1 and would have failed by a hair's whisker to get the pole. But we'll never know, because Max was always good in Sector 3. It was always his best sector, the best for the car. Maybe it was a way of doing the lap in the Max Verstappen vernacular, saving the tyres really for the last sector. And we'll never know exactly what he would have done. What we could say from precedent is that Max is always very, very good at finding 1 or 2 tenths when he needs to on his last runs in qualifying. And it wouldn't have taken much. He needed to find about 2 tenths on that last sector. So you take your pick, whether he would have done that or not. The reality is that he was not happy, of course, with Lando Norris, who was described by Max's engineer as being his mate. He said, well, you can thank your mate for that, Max, when Max bailed out of the lap. And what happened was that basically Lando was he'd done his lap, he was on a slow lap, and he was going into the last chicane. Max was catching him quickly. And instead of just moving over to the left and stopping, basically, or moving over to the right and stopping, letting Max pass into the chicane uninhibited, he basically didn't do anything wrong. He just went slowly into the chicane and Max had nowhere to go. He was right on his entry point. He just had to come out of the throttle and that was it. Can you blame McLaren for that? They were certainly giving Lando warnings about Max from the middle of Sector 2, maybe even the beginning of Sector 2. McLaren do it slightly differently from most teams, I think. Most teams talk about gaps, 10 seconds away, 7, they count it down like that, which gives the driver, I guess, a feel for his approach speed. McLaren were doing it by just saying rather vaguely, when for example, Lando was on turn 14, they would say turn 14, Max turn 13. In other words, Max is a corner behind. But there wasn't that sense of urgency of how quickly he was catching Lando. And Lando got 2 bits of information based on next 2 corners, but it was a bit arbitrary, as you can imagine, because Max was catching him very quickly. He was on potentially a pole lap and Lando was on a slowdown lap. So I think a lot of the blame, if that's the right word, should be apportioned to McLaren for the system they use there. There was no sense of urgency. And I'm sure and I'm sure Lando doesn't feel good about this. And I'm sure Lando would think, if I knew exactly where he was, I would have moved over for him. But he didn't. He was right in the way, and it was not good. It was not a good look. And it was a counterpoint. It was a savage counterpoint to McLaren's approach to Lando at the beginning of FP3 this morning when he got into the car, was about the first out on the track, wanted to sort of redress the balance of where he'd finished on Friday very unsatisfactorily. And he was quick. He was very quick out of the box, looked like the old Lando. And before long, we heard that it was welcome back Lando, welcome back to reality. You're right there now with Oscar and we're going to be really quick here. And that's always tempting fate, of course, isn't it? Because, you know, it all fell away. And I say fell away. He was beaten by Oscar, and he's starting P5, something like that, beaten by Kimi Antonelli in the other Mercedes. So, yeah, not good. And no surprise that Max was saying, I remember that, because it was partly because it was Q3 and partly because it was the pole in his, potentially the pole in his world. But that's the sort of thing you remember anyway. Even if it happened in FP3 or FP1, you'd remember that because it was just not good. You don't just stay where you are and not make an allowance. I mean, if you follow a lot of the drivers on onboards and you sort of do a whole session with the driver, you'll see how often they basically just stop to let other cars pass to make sure they're in no way impeding that car. And that's really what Lando should have done at that point. And I suspect it's because he didn't get enough urgency from the team of exactly where Max was. And it ruined the lap. It kind of ruined it for the fans, but on the other side of the coin, what a sensational lap for George Russell. It was this week on a live stream that a listener asked an interesting question. Interesting, quite complicated question we get on the live stream. So if you haven't seen one or been a part, here's the invitation. They're a lot of fun. Anyway, this question was, Peter, if you take the best long corner drivers in Formula One at the moment, and just to define that, these are drivers that basically brake in a straight line, turn in wider and drive with the rear of the car, as distinct from, say, Max, Charles when he's doing it well, Lewis, Isaac Hadjar, probably a bit of Kimi Antonelli in there, turning in on the brakes, shortening the corner, using the front of the car more, creating a sweet spot around a rotation point, which isn't necessarily the geometrical apex. Don't want to get into too much complication, but two different distinct ways of driving, which I don't know if engineers of Grand Prix teams segment them that way. They're probably aware that there are different styles, but anyway, that's the way we do it on our channel. And anyway, the question was, if you take the best long corner drivers of today, and I think the viewer suggested Oscar, Lando, George Russell, Carlos Sainz, which I thought was a pretty good quartet. He said, which one of those, he or she, I can't remember, which one of those most closely resembles the way Ayrton Senna drove? Because Ayrton was also a long corner driver. He braked in a straight line. So it's not to say this is a slow way of driving, it's just a different style. Mostly braked in a straight line, wider entry, and it showed up completely in contrast with the way Alan Prost drove, for example, at McLaren, turning in earlier and much shorter entries. Nigel Mansell, very like Prost as well. And in answer to that question, I said, anyway, getting to the point, in answer to that question, I said, well, I thought George Russell. It was sort of without hesitation, because George does drive very like Ayrton in the way Ayrton drives, the way Ayrton put a lap together. George similarly puts a lap together. Of course, you can't say he's as good as Ayrton Senna, although I've got to say that lap today was the sort of lap that Ayrton would have driven and put in, and if he was watching from above now, I'm sure he'd think, yes, good lap. And it was a good lap. It was a very good lap by George Russell, and so we shouldn't in any way detract from that with all the Max talk, but it would be inappropriate not to remember that Max never really got his shot for the pole on that last phase of Q3. Anyway, with George, it was, I say that comparing with Ayrton because there was a sort of energized, frenetic feel to the lap that George put together, which was very similar to watching Ayrton Senna. And what I was thinking when I answered that question on the live stream, what I'm kind of thinking now is that for younger viewers, people who weren't fortunate enough to see Ayrton driving, if you watch George now, that's pretty similar, give or take a bit, obviously. It's pretty similar to the way Ayrton drove in terms of the way he prescribes the corners, the way he creates the lap and puts it together. And one thing specifically I thought was very Ayrton-like was the way George, and for that matter, Kimi Antonelli, I wonder whether Kimi showed that to George or George showed it to Kimi, I don't know. Because Kimi's good on slow corners, isn't he? Very, very good. But what was interesting, going into turn one, which is a left-hander initially, and then it tightens up through an S's, and then it goes into another tighter left. Everybody that I saw and could kind of watch in detail was going through that, going down from 8th down to 4th into that first left-hander, effectively turn one, and then braking again and getting down to 3rd for the slower left-hander, which is, I guess, turn 3, and then they're accelerating out of there. But George and Kimi, but let's talk about George because he got the pole. George, from 8th, goes straight to 3rd there for the first part of that. Unbelievable revs, like 11,500 revs when he's in 3rd. You can hear it on the onboards, like this, and the engine's screaming, and he's going in with this sort of inertia, energy, high rev thing going into this 4th gear corner, if you like. But it was classic Ayrton. Ayrton used to do that, and used to think, why are Alain's revs lower there? Is there something wrong with his engine compared with Ayrton? And it's a similar thing. George loves to have that feel of those revs, and he was doing. He and Kimi were the only two doing it there. And that, to me, that was when I thought, wow, this is a really energized lap. This is George right on it. And just to put that in contrast, when he's got the DRS open at the end of the straight, the engine's doing like 11.2, 11.3, and he's doing 11.5 in 3rd going into that first corner. But that was the pole. Of course, he was probably doing it elsewhere too, compared with others. Now you could say, well, if that's the quick way to go, why wasn't Max doing it? Well, of course, there's two ways of driving, short corners, long corners for a start. And Max Verstappen, I can't imagine it would ever enter his peripheral vision to take that initial corner in 3rd. It's not the way he drives. He likes the car settled and calmer. And here's the rub on George's system, the system that got him the pole, albeit with the Max thing. The problem with that is that I don't believe that's repeatable in the race. I don't believe the George lap in general is repeatable in the race, any more than Ayrton's pole laps were really repeatable in the race. If you look at the number of poles Ayrton got compared with the number of fastest race laps, it's disproportionate towards the pole, which Ayrton lived for the pole, of course. He loved getting the pole. But if you look at Alain Prost, far fewer poles and many, many more fastest race laps. So there's two ways of, cutting the cake. And from Max's point of view, I think he's got a car that he's right on top of in terms of time management, the way he's going to run it in the race on full tanks and everything else. And I think George could potentially have a problem of repeating the sort of lap he's put together on full tanks on the opening lap, let alone over a Grand Prix distance. I think that's the difference. And that whole screaming of the engine and the higher revs, I don't think he's going to be able to do that in the race. And I think, it's going to be a completely different ballpark tomorrow. Having said that, of course, it's always a lot of drama going to that first corner in Singapore. Max is going to be on the inside, which is good. On the other side of the coin, George is going to be on the clean side of the road, which is good. But George has kind of already set it up a little bit, hasn't he? He said, Max is so good off the line. Well, we'll see tomorrow how it goes. But it's teed up to be an amazing race in that respect. With Oscar Piastri, who did upstage Lando at the end, he put in some really good laps under pressure in Q1, Q2, and then in Q3. He will think, and I guess the cliche in the McLaren media thing will be maximize the car, got the best from the car. How do they know that? We just don't know. And it's hard to believe that the McLaren-Mercedes is not as good a car, at least as a Red Bull, Honda, or indeed a factory Mercedes around Singapore. And I think George, compared with Oscar, was just getting a little bit more from the car. I think everything was perfect with George, the way he was driving. Oscar has a slightly more oversteery way of driving, slightly more rounded in what he's doing. You can just see it scrubbing off speed a little bit, whereas George, when he's on it, on a new set of Pirelli softs, with the straight lines and this sort of seamless transition from one straight line to another, pretty much in the way Ayrton used to do it, is pretty hard to beat for a long corner driver. And Oscar and Lando are both kind of long corner drivers, not to the extent that Liam Lawson is, but they're there. And I think today they were outdone by George. And I think Max is in a Red Bull Honda. How do we compare that with anything else? All we can say is Yuki Tsunoda again didn't look very good, or not very quick anyway, although he did a half reasonable job, I guess. But Max was very good in the Red Bull Honda, and I think he's the only guy that would have taken it to George in more or less equal cars today and got the pole. So it's going to be close. But I think we'll see it, sorting itself out, assuming there are no dramas at the first corner along the lines that I was suggesting. P4, splitting the two McLarens is no mean feat, is it, for Kimi Antonelli? Unbelievable, really. We've been saying all year how good he is on slow corners, and he does turn in early, and he's got this short corner feel. The only corners that were really ever going to give him any problem in Singapore were going to be the quick corners right at the end of the lap. As I've been saying a lot, it's not his thing. It feels like his thing is medium speed, slow speed corners, and those are quite quick. From 6th down to 5th, and then 6th again through that double apex left. It's a quick corner. But Kimi was sort of doing the George thing there and just quite harsh with the steering, quite spiky on initial turn-in, and living with it and getting away with it and out-qualifying Lando Norris. So good on him. Good job. Very good job. Lando disappointing, I think, because, he did find the rhythm, I think, in FP3, but it kind of all went away again for whatever reason. Very difficult to tell. And Oscar has the advantage now in terms of the championship. Maybe Max is still in it. I don't know. Let's wait and see how it transpires tomorrow night in Singapore. But the moment Oscar looked, as I said yesterday, more on top of the lap than Lando Norris. So a disappointing day for Lando. And then we get to the two Ferraris. Very good day for Lewis Hamilton. He will think, well, he's got to say, well, P6 is not enough. We need to be further up the grid than that. But privately, for him to be quicker than Charles, albeit by a tiny margin, is a very good thing for Lewis Hamilton. That's the gold standard at Ferrari, Charles Leclerc. And Lewis did it. Both of them ragged. Lewis quite oversteery still, not looking like the driver he could be or can be in terms of short corners and using the front of the car, but definitely more confident with the car, sliding it more, but losing time doing that a little bit. And Charles just generally frustrated and not looking like Charles, just looking like he's had a bad race in Baku, and it's still kind of irritating him now. And it showed up on the last corner of his last lap in qualifying when he did that thing where you go from 6, you brake, just touch the brakes, go from 6th to 5th in the middle of that left-hander. And the back end got away from him. Unbelievable car control from Charles, just boom, like that reflex action. Beautiful to watch, but not quick, obviously. And then he's go past the start-finish line. The other reaction from Charles, which is the emotional side, and he's just sort of waving his hand as if to say, well, you can chuck that lap away. Whether that was discussed with himself or the team, I don't know. But he A, being slower than Lewis will have annoyed him, and B, not being quick anyway will have annoyed him. If they were 1-2, maybe he'd be feeling slightly better. I don't know, maybe not. Looking at the other results very quickly, Isaac Hadjar, again, very, very good to be P8. Says a lot about him and the team, that they're annoyed that they're not quicker than that. They think they should have at least out-qualified the Ferraris. Isaac admitting to an error, which nonetheless he still qualified 8th and made it through to Q3, which is astonishing, particularly to the background of Liam Lawson's weekend, where he crashed again very early on in FP3. Mechanics having rebuilt the car from yesterday, he basically had the same accident again at the beginning of FP3. This was at turn 7, where there's a large curb on exit, and I guess everybody knows if you hit that curb at the wrong angle, you can basically beach the car and the back or the front can come off the road, and it's a big drama. That's exactly what he did. He hit that curb at the wrong angle. He's on a quick lap, FP3, trying to get his confidence back, I guess. Went up on that curb sideways, or not, had angle on the car, much more load on the car than you'd ever see a Max or a George or a Charles having on the car at that point. Hit at this angle with this load, and it just beached it and just pitched it sharp right into the Tech Pro barrier and took another corner off the car. And this is a good racing car. This is a very good Formula One car that Isaac Hadjar is regularly driving very well and potentially will be in very good points tomorrow. So for Liam Lawson, I mean, it's odd to me that the team aren't saying to Liam, turn in as late as you want, but at least get your rotation mid-corner sorted so that you got a much straighter exit for things like that curb issue. And when Liam hit that and had the shine, he said, I don't know what happened, hit something with the curb. It's kind of like he had no idea what was going on. But if you hit the curb with that much load on and that much angle, it's going to beach the car. Anyway, that happened, and that was not good. And the other thing that was not good was that both Williams were found in Parc Fermé afterwards to be in breach of rear wing technical regulations and basically disqualified from qualifying, and will be starting from the back of the grid. So not good for the Williams team there. It wasn't their greatest qualifying session. Neither of them made it through on this occasion into Q3. But nonetheless, for a team that professional, not good. A shout out to Oliver Behrman, did a great job, qualified P9 for Haas Ferrari. Another very good job. And Fernando Alonso, P10, disappointing in the context of where Aston Martin were yesterday. but they seem to lose their way, and in obviously a difficult car that Lance Stroll couldn't even get out of Q1 again. Fernando made it through to Q3, albeit in 10th place. So yeah, it just shows how well Fernando's driving, but he always drives bad cars very well. That's the thing about Fernando, isn't it? So fascinating race tomorrow, fascinating first corner, let alone first lap, to see the battle between George and Max, and indeed to see how the Oscar Lando battle pans out as well. So look forward to that. And mentioning Ayrton as we did at the beginning of this video, don't forget that you can pre-order the REC Watch DNA edition of the Ayrton Senna Lotus 98T chassis number 4, some alley from that actual car that Ayrton raced the back end of '86 in the face of this beautiful REC watch. And you can order that with an additional discount if you mention the code word Peter if you go to the description below this video. Thanks of course to REC Watches, to Jetcraft, to TrackNinja and to OEM Exclusive. Let's see what happens tomorrow. Take care. See you then.